Hey everybody, it's Mark Stellingworth with Brigadoon Radio. Today I have Benjamin Shobert, who wrote an excellent book, Blaming China. It might feel good, but it won't fix America's economy. He gave a really great talk just about half an hour ago. Fascinating and just really fantastic. So this is your second time at Brigadoon?
It is, yeah.
Okay, and so what's bringing you back? What made you decide to come back and join us again?
It's a very unique group of thought leaders, people who are at various degrees entrepreneurs, involved in politics and policy. It's a pretty diverse group, so the conversations tend to be very intellectually stimulating. And I think it's just an opportunity to take a step away and just kind of reflect. I love the timing of it. It's on the other side of that crazy holiday season.
Right.
First 6 weeks of the year are always the most intense for me and my team. So it's like the perfect time to just take a pause, do some reflection, and there's enough structure here that you're getting some intellectual stimulation at the same time.
So, during your talk, you really focused on trade policy, which was, pretty interesting. And I want to ask a couple of questions here. Well, first, do you think that the tariffs are actually having the desired impact? And the other question is, to the title of your book, while there is a foreign policy dilemma with China, addressing that problem isn't just going to be about military buildup or diplomacy. It's also going to be about structurally correcting things within the United States. So if you could answer the first one.
Yeah, so there's some good news. I'll use air quotes. Some good news coming on the U.S.-China trade war front, which is that it's going to come to an end in the not too distant future. And so, from the perspective of at least the president, the tariffs were a useful forcing function to make that happen.
Okay.
I think the bigger structural concerns that people like Lighthizer and Navarro have about the structure of the Chinese economy and the ability of American companies to sell into, to not have to do joint ventures, to avoid some of the intellectual property theft issues, those are going to go largely unaddressed. And so I think that the administration will be able to articulate and will probably create some political goodwill using the idea that tariffs were a useful way to get the Chinese to the table. Whether or not that leads to the kind of structural reforms that allow the United States and China to become more interdependent is an open question to me.
So, in the most simplistic terms, nations that trade together are less likely to shoot at each other.
This was Tom Friedman's idea, right? The McDonald's hypothesis. Right?
Precisely, right. No two countries in McDonald's have ever fought a war against each other.
It ended in the Crimea conflict.
Oh.
So it's no longer the case. We can't.
So it's a hypothesis and no longer. Well, actually, it's not even. Not
even.
Well, regardless. So. Do you think that there are things that from a structural standpoint within the United States that we can address on the domestic side that could have a significant impact on the foreign policy side?
Yeah, the book is ostensibly about China, about the U.S.-China relationship, but it has a much heavier orientation than most people who come to it expect relative to what we need to be doing. And one of my fundamental arguments is that the United States is approaching China from a position of weakness and not strength. If we had, in fact, a more resilient domestic economy, if our political system was generating returns to the American middle class, to American blue-collar workers who do feel unsafe, unsettled because of globalization, because of technology, because of financial engineering, of those three threats, the easiest one to point towards and to blame is China. And so in the book, I'm arguing for a couple things. One is that China is not ready to lead. And the idea that China is going to be this, year after year growth story well into the middle of the 21st century, I think is just wrong. And so if that's in fact the case, then America still has every reason to believe that we can have another 100 years of peace and prosperity. But for that to happen, we have to have some really hard conversations about how our political economy is working. We have to talk about how the interests of capital and industry can be held in tension with the needs of labor. And those are conversations we haven't been willing to have. We've more or less, as I argue in the book, embraced a particular type of free market fundamentalism that has just said, listen, if you grew up where I grew up in rural Indiana, and your job is lost because of globalization, technology, financial engineering, you're just going to retrain. You're going to go somewhere else. And this particular moment of political malaise that the United States finds itself in is a byproduct of just more or less saying to people, figure it out. And I think this current administration, whether we like them, we dislike them, should be understood as giving a group of people who feel very unsettled about their future a voice. And we should do something with that, not just trivialize that.
Yeah, it reminds me of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century,
Sure.
where in slow-growing economies, there's a greater accumulation and concentration of wealth and a greater disparity of wealth in the long term. We have to try and structurally make changes that would allow us to do that. And to your point, the retraining component, in Northern Europe, they have fantastic adult education programs that we just don't have. And furthermore, on the corporate boards, they actually have labor as a presence. That's common in Germany as well as as well as Northern Europe. But do you think that changes like that within corporate governance as well as within policy measures from the federal government could enact changes that would give us an upper hand in terms of this relationship with China?
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, the conversation and the policy changes that we need to make are non-trivial. On the other hand, we can, to your point, look at other developed industrial economies that we compete with that have fairly robust roles for labor. And again, I say that as somebody who's been an entrepreneur 3 times, who's had my own experience with labor that wasn't entirely positive. And so I don't say that to trivialize the complexities, but I do think that we have, again, over the last 30 years, more or less said to labor, you're just going to have to figure this out, while we spiffed the system globally in such a way that made holders of capital and industrialists able to generate a really exorbitant return. And again, I say that as somebody who's spent my entire career in industry. I don't say that as somebody who's an activist.
Right.
I think we've taken some really, really good and even uniquely American ideas too far.
Interesting. Really. Well, listen, it was a great talk.
Appreciate it.
But one question, last question actually.
Yeah.
Book recommendation.
A recommendation. So I recently finished, my wife got me for Christmas, Michael Beschloss's newest book, Presidents at War. And it's I'm going to recommend it. It's very much a historian's review of how American presidents have looked at the Constitution as they've made decisions to bring America into war. And over the course of our country's history, you see presidents who try and use the constitutional framework to actually formally declare war, and then you see other presidents that very deliberately avoid that because of the political considerations in the Congress usually. But it's interesting in this moment where we're declaring a national emergency over a border wall to just revisit the number of times in our history where we've been willing to view the Constitution as somewhat elastic in furtherance of foreign policy or domestic considerations.
Well, the book is called Blaming China. Again, it might feel good, but it won't fix America's economy. Ben, fantastic read, I'm sure, and I look forward to you coming back.
Lovely to see you again. Really
Likewise.
enjoyed it.
See you.